Joe Holka Show presented by Line Movement. If you're wondering what this video is, it's a special video. Week 5 DraftKings picks, but also going to give you guys the top 5 picks against the spread for the tilt space. And if you haven't watched the tilt space yet, you'll know this is a show we're doing on Line Movement. Myself, Peter Overzet, Michael Leone, walking through what's going on throughout the day for DraftKings, but also our picks against the spread in the Super Contest Gold 5K winner take all contest in Vegas. So I think that's going to be a show that I'm looking forward to each and every week. Wanted to give you guys at least a little peek beneath the curtain on what we're looking at so far, at least against the spread this week. And also, of course, we're going to walk through the top DraftKings picks at each position, and we're going to use the NFL data table at linemovement.com to do it. So let's jump in. Before we get into the picks against the spread, going to kind of sprinkle those in between each position on DraftKings as we walk through our DraftKings picks. I forgot to mention that if you are interested in watching the tilt space, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time each and every Sunday. This week is a special week. We're going to be playing the Thunderdome on DraftKings, a $5,300 entry. So make sure and join us for that. I'm sure either way, maybe we'll be really happy like we were last week when we won $50K, or maybe we'll be really sad because we just punted $5K back of it to DraftKings. So that should be a really good time. If you're on this page for the first time, this is a free resource that is available at linemovement.com. Resources tab, NFL data table. So what we did here was we were trying to provide, I think, what really matters at each position, but also this is something that I used to make available to my Twitch subscribers behind the paywall. Now we're just giving it to you guys for free. So basically just trying to bring you as much value as possible and keep it really simple. I think that when you're looking at something like DFS, I'm a little bit more focused on ownership this time of the week than who are actually the best plays. Finding the best plays isn't necessarily the hardest thing to do in the world if you're looking at the right things and been doing this for a while. So one of the things that I'm really focused on at the quarterback position is trying to find guys that have a little bit of rushing ability. So what we're looking at today, obviously, if you did want to pay all the way up for Lamar Jackson, totally fine. Even if you think there's a little bit of an injury concern, we saw that pop up throughout the week. I think Lamar Jackson in tournaments, the ceiling is still there. I actually kind of like this Baltimore and Cincinnati game overall, but I think we need to spend a little bit more time today on some of the cheaper guys. So one of my favorite plays of the entire week is Teddy Bridgewater at 5,900. So he's someone that's definitely not a net zero in terms of the way that he can give us some equity on the ground. But I also think that just his weapons against this Atlanta team is just so strong. I think that there's plenty of guys that we can pair with him. I think there's plenty of pass, I think, for him hitting value at 5,900. I think that the ownership coming in around 5%, I would expect that at the higher stakes to be much higher this week. Atlanta's just a team that can be beat all over the field. So we're looking at here on the data table, they're actually 28th in the league at defending the short area pass. That's actually something that Teddy Bridgewater has done relatively well this year. Only 6.8 adjusted yards per attempt, but I do think that he's one of those guys that could benefit from this type of information, this type of matchup, I should say, even without Christian McCaffrey. We've seen Teddy Bridgewater get a little bit more comfortable as things go, maybe even a little bit more healthy in some ways, or a little bit more confident after that gruesome knee injury he had a couple of years ago. And seeing him run, seeing him take off for the end zone last week was something that I thought was really nice to see from a guy under 6K on DraftKings. I think Teddy Bridgewater is very solid. Also, you're going to hear a lot of people talking about Daniel Jones at 5,400 against this Dallas team that ranked 32nd in the league on defense per DVOA, but also 32nd at defending the deep ball. So we'll get to that at the wide receiver position, but I actually think Daniel Jones at 5,400, maybe you pair him with someone like Slayton who can get deep and really make that entire week for you on one play. Not exactly, I guess, excited about having Giants exposure for the first time this week, but I do think this is a fantastic spot to do it against Dallas, a team that has been just had on the other end. That's part of the reason they're not winning games, guys. They're just not playing very good defense. I think the pace and the game script overall could lead to Daniel Jones hitting value at 5,400. Again, projecting him for about the third most rushing yards on the entire slate behind Kyler Murray and Lamar Jackson. Just a fantastic value for a guy that should have a relatively solid floor if all breaks right here. All right, guys, we're doing it. Bets against the spread. The first one that I have for you guys is going to be Cleveland plus 1.5 against the Colts. And I think this is an interesting one, especially at the Super Contest where we get them at plus 1.5. I think that I think this game was interesting off the hop when I was looking at it earlier this week. The Colts are favored here on the road. Just doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I understand that they probably have the better defense overall. Like, that's probably not debatable, but I actually think that the Browns have improved a little bit recently. So I think they might have the ability to kind of slow down the Colts, I mean, I guess biggest offensive strengths. What they really struggle with is kind of being a little bit more multi-dimensional. So I think that that's an interesting aspect of this. I think that on the other side of the ball now, hopefully we get Kareem Hunt for a full workload now that we have Chubb on the IR. Also, Jarvis Landry, Odell Beckham Jr., Austin Hooper, they can do a lot of different things on offense regardless of how well, honestly, that Baker Mayfield is playing. I think he will be a little bit better this week at home. And I don't really have a ton of confidence in Phillip Rivers on the other side. So I think this is a spot where we could go ahead and go after them at plus 5.5 or 1.5 at a really strong value and feel pretty good about it. As for the Colts, they're actually 1-5 straight up in their past 6 road games, with that only win coming last week against the Bears on Sunday. So I like the Browns. I think they could win this one and cover the spread. I have it at 26-20 as a final score. We're talking week 5 DraftKings picks, now the running back position. This is the NFL data table at linemovement.com. And looking at the running back position today, I think there's one clear area of salary that I'm just going to live. So as we walk through some of the best plays, the top plays, it's hard to say any of that without talking about Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 6,800, Mike Davis, 6,400, and Kareem Hunt, 6,500. I've already built some lineups this week that have all 3 of them, and I think you're doing a solid job at really just capturing a ton of touches overall. And that's what we really want to focus on at running back, is just these guys that have a heavy role. They're going to have ability to be game script independent, number one. So Ezekiel Elliott, sure, if you want to pay all the way up for him at 7,800, I think he could be in for a massive week against the Giants if all breaks well. Maybe they lean into that running game a little bit more than they have in the past. So I think Zeke is totally fine at 7,800, but it's just really hard to avoid a guy like Mike Davis at 64 in the spot against Atlanta. We know Atlanta gives up a ton of production against running backs in the passing game, 28th at defending the short area of the field. So I think it could be another week. We get Christian McCaffrey hopefully back next week from that ankle injury, but Mike Davis is 6,400. Guys, I think he's at least $1,200, $1,500 underpriced still. So I think he's one of the best plays on the slate. You'll see that he's currently projected to be about 25% owned. Seems about right. I love Mike Davis in this spot, especially against Atlanta. Reasonable team total. I think you can play him with Teddy Bridgewater, who we mentioned in the quarterback section of this video. But I'm very bullish on Mike Davis at 6,400. Kareem Hunt. We just talked about Cleveland, how we're picking them for the tilt space in the super contest. I think they have a chance to play well in this game. So Kareem Hunt at 6,500. I do think that this is a spot where he can have a ton of success, projecting him for about 3 receptions, about 22 touches overall. I think it's a really great spot. I think at 6,500, we rarely get these bell cow backs for teams that we know want to run. So while the matchup against Indy isn't as strong as it is for maybe Mike Davis against Atlanta, still think Kareem Hunt can get there on volume alone in this spot. And I think that he has the upside to still be the number 1 running back play on the slate. I think that's within his range of outcomes for sure. The last guy that in that range that we have to talk about, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 6,800. Kansas City maybe going a little bit I guess, underappreciated in this spot against Vegas, at least the rumblings I've heard at this point of the week. I think that this team total at about 33 points at blitzspot.eu right now is one of those ones that we have to pay attention to. We know that Clyde Edwards-Helaire has not been getting in the end zone. Maybe he runs another one out from a little bit further, but honestly, just having access to the Kansas City running back is just so valuable. At some point, there's going to be a lot of points scored. At some point, those are going to skew back towards Helaire, so I'm not too worried about that. Almost 4 catches through the air is what his current projection is right now. At 6,800, he's just still a great value. These guys in the mid 6K range, it's really tough for me to personally get away from if you're playing cash games, but also figure out ways that I can be overweight on them in tournaments this week is something that I'm super interested in. So outside of those guys, we'll see if this game ends up happening between Tennessee and Buffalo. So not going to talk a ton about Derrick Henry. We mentioned Zeke at the top end, still totally fine. I think if you wanted to get a little bit different with someone like Josh Jacobs or Miles Sanders, still makes a ton of sense overall. Maybe we go back to the well with Joe Mixon. I think there's some people that might be scared off with this Baltimore matchup, but we've seen it before. Mixon can really have success in any matchup because of the volume that he gets, because he's still very active in the passing game. We saw his ceiling last week. Maybe people just don't go back to him because of the matchup. I think that might be potentially a mistake. So that's kind of where I'm going to live this week. I don't normally pay all the way down at the running back position. If you wanted to get a little bit more thin, I could see maybe getting Myles Gaskin involved at 4,800. I think you can probably project him for about 15 touches, maybe 4 catches through the air at his ceiling. So I don't think there's a really a large amount of upside here with Gaskin, but if you get in a pinch, I think at 4,800, I guess he's at least reasonable, though I'm doing everything I can to get up to this mid 6K range for those 3 guys we talked about. For those of you guys that don't know, for the Westgate Super Contest Gold, we have to pick 5 picks against the spread each and every week. The Tilt Space Boys, me, Leone, Overzet. Our second pick that we have for you guys, Baltimore minus 12.5 against the Bengals. And this one was a little bit of an aggressive line to attack. I think that it could go terribly wrong in this one, but I'm pretty confident that Baltimore is going to roll here. I think now that they have Lamar Jackson and just in general, this like committee of guys that they can get the ball downfield to, like Marquise Brown, Mark Andrews, just having a ton of upside in the red zone. I think when they're kind of firing on all cylinders, it's really hard to stop this team. Now, keep an eye on what's going on with Lamar and that injury, but I think he's going to be totally fine in this one. I just love kind of the ability to play this Ravens team that I still think hasn't really shown their full potential yet this year. I think they're going to be playing far ahead most of this game. I think there's a spot where against this Bengals defense, I don't really know if they have anyone that can stop Lamar Jackson and what he does on the ground. So I think that while Joe Burrow and Joe Mixon have both been playing well on the other side, I don't really think it's going to be enough. The Bengals actually have gone winless in their last 15 straight road games. So maybe it's attempting to kind of bet against them in this spot. That's kind of where we're at. They are 10-5 against the spread in those games though. So that's a concern for sure. So I guess if Lamar is going to be limited, I don't mind the idea of going on the other side of this one. So I could see this being the one bet that we're going to talk about today, the one that we maybe end up flip-flopping on. We'll see. Make sure you guys check out the Tilt Space, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. We'll walk through this. Also, the Thunderdome on DraftKings. It's going to be a great time. $5,300 entry on DraftKings. Hopefully we can run it back. We had a 50K win last week. Would love to kind of chat with you guys. The Line Movement YouTube channel, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. Back to the DraftKings picks and back to the NFL data table at linemovement.com. We're talking wide receiver. So the first thing that I want to do on this page, and again, if you take anything from this video, this free resource at linemovement.com, at the wide receiver position, weighted opportunity rating is the one thing that I really focus on each and every week. It's basically a mixture between target market share, but also market share of air yards for these teams. So it's one of the most predictive metrics. Shout out Josh Hermsmeyer at airyards.com that I'm thinking that if there's anything on this page, if I had one column, it'd be weighted opportunity rating. So it basically can help us find some of these players that are really underpriced overall. So one of the first guys that pops out to me as being a top DraftKings wide receiver this week, basically taking into consideration price, Darius Slayton at 4,800. We talked a little bit about Danny Dimes in the quarterback section, but guys, the ability to beat this team deep, 32nd in the league in terms of defending the deep ball, the Cowboys. So I think that Slayton at 4,800, he's just underpriced relative to his weighted opportunity and just his type of volume that he's seeing down the field from Danny Dimes in this spot. So 0.6 weighted opportunity for Slayton. I think he's a fantastic play in that range. I'm really trying to focus overall on these guys that have a little bit more upside at the position. So I really like him quite a bit. I think keep an eye on this DeAndre Hopkins injury at 7,900. A little bit tougher for me to get there, but I do think there's going to be a decent amount of ownership there. And speaking of ownership, do we have a clear lean between Amari Cooper and Calvin Ridley? I've been trying to figure out if Calvin Ridley is going to be the guy on the other side of my Teddy Bridgewater Carolina stacks. I think that there's a little bit of a concern there with the injury also. And 7,500 for a guy like Calvin Ridley, but if he's healthy, I think I do prefer him at the top end. I'm a little bit nervous. I'll say this about Dallas, that this could be the game that maybe we end up seeing a little bit more Zeke. Maybe they end up playing from ahead. They've been playing from behind in all of these games. So I think Amari, if you're playing cash games, Amari's a little bit more of a tough sell for me personally. I think some of the other guys that we're talking about in terms of their weighted opportunity, I think that if you really want to jump off of these Carolina options after a tough week, this might be an unfortunate week to do so. I'll say this. I actually do have a lot of interest in DJ Moore yet again in this spot. He's someone that still a 0.3 weighted opportunity rating. Curtis Samuel is up there as well. Robbie Anderson at 5,900. I think all of these guys are really interesting. So Robbie Anderson, a 0.6 weighted opportunity, is someone that I think could still continue to eat in this spot. Probably underpriced relative to some of the other guys in his range. So 5,900 for him. He was a clear price play that I thought made a ton of sense to go towards this week. Talked about this on the wide receiver video earlier this week, the sleeper video with Matt Harmon. So be sure and check that video out if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about some cheaper wide receivers. But T. Higgins at 4,900, even against Baltimore, that a lot of people are going to perceive as a really tough matchup. I think that his volume kind of taking over that AJ Green role, that's something that we've seen. We've seen a lot of evidence that T. Higgins is going to start to see that type of volume. So I think he's interesting at 4,900. I think someone else that might kind of go a little bit overlooked because he's a little bit more expensive than I'd like to see. But Terry McLaurin at 6,100, we'll see if this ends up being an upgrade at quarterback with Haskins now on the bench. But just looking at the things, again, guys, that I know truly matter. Odell Beckham Jr., Marquise Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, the other guy at 0.7 weighted opportunity on this slate, it's Terry McLaurin. He's the cheapest one of those guys. So I think that he's super interesting. Again, if you are going to be rolling out some Lamar stacks, Marquise Brown at 6,300, I actually think he's an interesting one-off play in tournaments also because he's someone that can really hit value for you guys just on his own. So we're really trying to focus on that at the wide receiver position. A pretty easy transition here, guys, as we're looking at our third pick against the spread for the Tilt Space boys. Carolina plus 1.5 against the Falcons. And honestly, guys, I kind of think that the Falcons are kind of turning into like the Texans of the NFC South because their defense is just pathetic. I think that Matt Ryan, sure, he's going to be able to do some things on the other side to hopefully keep this game going back and forth a little bit for points. But I think the Panthers are just playing so well with Teddy Bridgewater. Their offense is probably, I guess, arguably more diversified without Christian McCaffrey. We talked about some of those weapons like Anderson, like DJ Moore. We'll get to Ian Thomas in a second. But I think that this could be a game that has a lot of scoring, but I think it's going to be back and forth a little bit. So I think that the Carolina Panthers are going to be able to take advantage of some of their receivers against this defense, but also Atlanta's going to be able to keep pace a little bit more and keep this thing close. So though I do think that the line is at least interesting, plus 1.5 for Carolina is one that we're very interested in so far. All right, we're back over on linemovement.com in the data table to walk through our tight end DraftKings picks for week 5. I think that what you should really be focusing on in this sheet is trying to target guys that are in scenarios where there's going to be a lot of points scored. We know the tight end position, there's going to be less routes, less targets overall. So focusing on some of the large team totals is something that I'm really trying to do. And if we're looking at some of the same things that we look at for wide receiver, weighted opportunity rating, one of the things that I really think is important at tight end is just getting guys that are running routes. So if we're looking at guys in terms of their yards per route run, that's something we can look at, but also just their cumulative routes run per game over the last 4 is something that's really valuable. So Zach Ertz, Evan Ingram, Travis Kelce, Logan Thomas, these guys are running a ton of routes. I think that Logan Thomas, his biggest problem, 3,500 this week. I think he's an interesting value option, but he just hasn't seen a lot of catchable balls over the last few weeks. So maybe there ends up being a little bit of a quarterback increase. We talked about Terry McLaurin in the wide receiver section, but I think at 3,500, he's interesting. I think if you wanted to continue to add to the list of guys for Carolina that you're trying to play this week, maybe Ian Thomas at 3,400 in that same range is still very interesting. His routes run over the last little while, over 25 per game. That's still very reasonable in this spot with a nice team total. We know Atlanta, again, 28th at defending the short area of the field. So maybe it's Ian Thomas at 3,400. I think if we're looking at the top end, sure, guys like George Kittle, Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, Darren Waller, all these guys are in play. If I had to pick one, I do think it's Travis Kelce for me this week. We mentioned that I think that some of these KC guys might go even a little bit overlooked relative to this spot against this Raiders team that we're targeting for fantasy. I think that there's an argument to be made for this high total as well. These are the type of spots where Kelce can just go absolutely crazy and break the slate. Now, looking at ownership, looks like it's going to be relatively spread out. So if we're trying to get to that next tier of ceiling, and I do think that there's a decent amount of value at running back. Obviously, there's these guys in the 6K range that are extremely strong. I think making Kelce a priority in tournaments is something that I'm going to be trying to do. If you don't want to go that route, maybe you're kind of just stacking up maybe a Tyreek Hill narrative for KC. Bringing it back with Darren Waller is something I think makes a ton of sense. He's only 5,900. Again, looking at something like his weighted opportunity, he's leading the entire slate over the last 4 games in terms of the type of volume he's seeing and also seeing some stuff down the field, which is really valuable in today's fantasy world, and still top 10 in his yards per route run. So seeing some deeper targets is something I always like to see. I think tight end is relatively straightforward. It's kind of getting up to this different tier like Kittle, like Kelce. Again, I think my preference is Kelce there, or really going down to someone like Logan Thomas, Ian Thomas, some of these guys that are definitely a little bit more thin, but allow you to do some more things in roster construction. Now, who do the Tilt Space boys have as their 4th pick against the spread in the Super Contest this week? I'm going to tell you, Dallas Cowboys minus 9.5. We're going back to the well with this one. We've actually picked the Cowboys in a couple weeks already this year, and it hasn't gone so well, but we are going to double down here. I think that they're a team that, they kind of needed a miracle to beat the Falcons at home. They didn't get those prayers answered against the Browns, but I think that this is a spot where maybe they won't have to rely on Dak Prescott to throw 50 plus times. Maybe they get back to that running game with Ezekiel Elliott and kind of protect that lead by just getting ahead and then kind of keeping control of the ball from there, and they just isn't enough time for the Giants to come back. I definitely think that's something that we could see happen in this one. Maybe it doesn't shape up as well for points as some people think, but I do think that the Cowboys should win this one and feel pretty good about it, even going into the second half. Maybe they just lean on Zeke a little bit more. One of the reasons the Cowboys were the favorite to win the NFC East this year is they always seem to take care of business in the division. So since the start of 2017, Cowboys are 15-3, both straight up and against the spread against NFC East teams, 6-0 straight up and against the spread against the Giants. So I think this is a fantastic spot. This Giants team just hasn't been playing very well. We know that, but also in their past 17 road games, the Giants have gone an ugly 4-13 straight up. So it's kind of an interesting spot overall. I think we're on the Cowboys again. We'll see how that goes. Defense is a tough position overall to get right. So on DraftKings for week 5, there's a couple that stand out, I guess, on both sides of the salary spectrum, but we're really focusing on a couple of things. We want to see there be a lot of pressure. We also want to see there be a decent game script, so there's going to be a lot of passing on the other side that could lead to turnovers. That's the best way to give yourself a chance at backing in to one of these touchdowns on defense. So I think that more often than not, I'm trying to get a little bit different, not kind of pay into some of this ownership, but I think that if you did want to pay all the way up this week, $3,800, the Steelers against this Philly team that just has so many offensive line issues. I think they'll be extremely popular, and for good reason. We know the Steelers are probably the worst possible matchup for Philly to have when they're having offensive line issues. So I think if you wanted to pay up, they would be the clear option for me. If we're paying down, there's not really a ton to like here, guys. I think overall, if we get this Titan spot against Buffalo, that was one that I had a little bit of interest in. I think if we wanted to pay down and go to something like the Texans at 2,600 against Jacksonville, they were one that I thought was interesting. They're favorite, almost a touchdown favorite against this Minshew quarterback that will take sacks, will make mistakes overall. So I think that is one that I would have some interest in. I think Washington against LA is kind of a unique spot. We know Washington has a really strong defensive front. Say what you want about the Washington football team. They do have a defense that will pressure, get to the quarterback. We know Jared Goff really struggles in those scenarios. So I think that's an interesting one at lower ownership. Just a tough week at defense overall. But I think there's a couple options, like we mentioned. Paying up for the Steelers, probably the optimal play in weeks where you feel like you have a little bit more salary to work with. And there's an argument in favor that you might have a little bit more salary this week than in others. It gets tough when you pay that much for a defense that maybe fails. It really sets back the rest of your team. All right, last pick against the spread for the Tilt Space boys. Again, if you haven't already, make sure you join us at 6:30 p.m. Eastern time live. We are going to be doing the Thunderdome this week on DraftKings, $5,300 entry. But these picks against the spread, this Westgate Super Contest, winner take all, 5K entry in this as well. We're in a pretty good spot, so let's try and not screw it up. This last pick I'm really excited about. Arizona -7. Another one of those picks that we've been kind of going towards over these last couple weeks, but I think they cover against the Jets. I think just fading the Jets overall has been a pretty winning strategy for bettors recently. 0-4 against the spread this season, 7-3 over the past 20 games. That's one of the worst marks over that span. So I think that this team, they rank 30th in the league in scoring defense, and also this Arizona offense has looked pretty decent lately. Like Kyler Murray, more than up for the challenge in terms of putting up some numbers on the other side. So I actually think this is one that makes a ton of sense overall. I think the Cardinals roll here, and you'll see them be maybe one of the more popular bets against the spread picks this week, but I do think it's pretty good chalk. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. The first time we've walked through some of our picks against the spread in terms of the tilt space. Love those guys. It's going to be a lot of fun to maybe do this each and every week. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more videos just like this one. Consider subscribing to the channel and tossing a like on here before you get out of here. And I'll see you guys Sunday morning. I do go live at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time right here on the Joe Holka YouTube channel. And directly after that, we'll talk a little bit more betting on the Line Movement channel at 11 a.m. Eastern time. I'll see you guys then.